Today on Brief History, we take a look at an English king with one of the most incredible stories in the history of the English monarchy. During his life, disastrous events would lead to difficult times and even more difficult circumstances as he searched for ways to overcome his appalling situation. His time as king would see civil conflict, international war, religious struggles, and a king entangled in the excesses of lust. Join me as I take a brief look at the merry monarch remembered today as King Charles II of England. Charles was born on May 29, 1630, at St. James's Palace, Westminster, London. His father was the infamous Charles I of England, and his mother was the French-born Henrietta Maria. He was the eldest child of 6 surviving children, and some of his siblings would end up playing an integral role during his life. These siblings included his sister Mary, who would be married off to the Prince of Orange, William II, his brother James, who would have an incredible life story in his own right, his brother Henry, who was 10 years younger than Charles, and his youngest sister Henriette, who would eventually be known by the nickname Minette. Due to the incredible events that were to take place during Charles' life, giving a brief synopsis of the time leading up to his birth is necessary to fully understand what Charles was soon to experience. Charles' father became king when he was 25 years old in 1625, and although Charles would be born 5 years after his father inherited the crown, many problems already existed in England. Immediately after becoming king, Charles' father and Parliament were at odds with one another, and it was specifically the Commons that became a thorn in Charles' father's side. Charles' grandfather, James I, and his father, Charles I, were both advocates of something known as the divine rights of kings, or absolutism, which essentially meant that they believed that the king's rights and privileges were derived from God, and that no person on earth had the right to infringe on their royal prerogative. In other parts of the world this may have been acceptable, but in England it was not, as Parliament had already established itself as a necessity in order for the government and country as a whole to function properly. Thus, after Charles' father and Parliament butted heads over and over, his father would set an unfortunate precedent where he would dissolve Parliament if it would not cede to his demands. When Charles' father then attempted to find roundabout ways of taxing and going to war without consent of Parliament, serious events took place which eventually culminated into something known as the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. The Wars of the Three Kingdoms were made up of multiple conflicts, including the First English Civil War, the Second English Civil War, and the Anglo-Scottish War, sometimes referred to as the Third Civil War. All three will be discussed during Charles' story. When Charles was born in 1630, much of the major conflicts had not yet taken place in England. He was christened by Bishop William Laud, and his godparents included his uncle, the at the time King of France, Louis XIII. Charles' birth was celebrated, as he was the first male heir to be born to England in over a century, the last one being Henry VIII's son, Edward VI. Charles' nursery was initially looked after by the Countess of Dorset, and soon his establishment was moved to Greenwich and then on to Richmond. He was eventually made Prince of Wales and a Knight of the Garter just before his 8th birthday. It was said that Charles was initially a very shy and passive child, which concerned some of those around him. But this was addressed and corrected with great success, and soon Charles became a much more lively child. Around the time he was installed as Knight of the Garter, he was removed from the establishment ran mostly by women and put in the care of a governor, William Cavendish, Earl of Newcastle, who many believed was Charles' greatest influence in life. In contrast to his grandfather and father, Charles was not said to have been particularly bookish and did not put as much emphasis on religion as those kings before him. An agreement had been reached between his father and the French with regard to the marriage negotiations for Charles' mother's hand, who was a Catholic. It was initially agreed that Charles was to be baptized in the Catholic faith and raised by his mother for the first 12 years of his life. However, this would not end up happening. After relations with France deteriorated, Charles was indeed baptized as an Anglican and raised Protestant. Nevertheless, as was the case with many previous kings and queens of England, this issue, the issue of religion, is something that will become very important during Charles' life. As Charles grew as a child, he was said to have become more independent and assertive, and this was probably for the best, due to the fact that by 1640, events in England took a drastic turn. Scotland rebelled against Charles' father in a conflict known today as the Bishops' Wars, which was part of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms discussed previously and a precursor to the First English Civil War. Due to Charles' governor being involved in plots with Charles' father that furthered a deterioration of relations between Charles' father and Parliament, he retired his governorship, which was then given to a man named William Seymour, Marquis of Hertford. This man was said to have had little impact on Charles during his life. Fears that Charles' father was tolerating popery, i.e. Catholicism, ran rampant in Parliament, and it wasn't long before Parliament instructed Charles' new governor to forbid him from seeing his Catholic mother. However, in February 1462, Charles' father sent his mother back to the continent, in part for her safety, and then turned his attention to young Charles. The king ordered that Charles be moved from Hampton Court to Greenwich, in order that the two could meet up. Parliament obviously did not wish to see this happen, and thus sent a commission to seize Charles. However, the king was quicker than Parliament was, and luckily was able to take control of young Charles before the parliamentary commissioners arrived. Charles and his father then moved to York, and it was not long before the First English Civil War broke out in 1642, when Charles was around 12 years old. Charles remained with his father for some time, both when in the field and when his father moved to his headquarters in Oxford. He and his brother James were actually present for the first pitched battle of the war, the Battle of Edgehill, in October 1642, although neither of the brothers played a role and were removed to the rear for their safety. But soon Charles' role was to change in order that he be utilized as a royal representative and military leader. Obviously, due to his youth, being 14 years old in 1644, he was not truly commanding soldiers or making great decisions, but he was given a great counsel and sent to the West Country to take nominal command of forces there. But the parliamentarians and their new model army would be too much for Charles' father and the Royalist Cavaliers, as the Royalists would become known. The parliamentarian cause had been furthered by some great military leaders, most notably a lower-born Puritan member of Parliament who rose through the ranks of the army with stunning success, Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell will come up again throughout some of Charles' story. As Charles' father and his forces lost decisive battles, such as that of Marston Moor and Naseby, the royalist situation in England soon became dire. By 1646, most of the West was being occupied by the parliamentarian Roundheads, as they were known, and thus it was decided that Charles needed to flee from his home country for the continent. In March, he and his council fled from Pendennis Castle, where they had been sheltering, to the Isles of Scilly. It was time for the prince to endure the next difficult chapter of his life in a foreign land. He and his entourage traveled to the Scilly Isles off the southwest tip of the Cornish coast, where they were met with miserable weather and living conditions. They were soon greeted with a messenger from Parliament, inviting Charles to surrender. Shortly thereafter, a parliamentarian fleet surrounded the island, and it looked as if Charles' flight would be cut short. However, in a stroke of luck, a storm appeared and drove the parliamentarian ships away, allowing Charles and his advisors a chance to escape. This they did, and traveled from the Scilly Isles to the island of Jersey in the English Channel, near the coast of modern-day Normandy, France. This would have certainly been a welcome change for Charles, as Jersey's living situation was much better. The island was better supplied and fortified, and Charles was put up at Elizabeth Castle, there on the island. Here he replied to the parliamentarians that he would be willing to negotiate from this island. The parliamentarians' resources, being sucked up on the mainland, were not able to immediately be redeployed to attack the island. But Charles' father's situation continued to deteriorate. He would eventually be forced to surrender, but in a politically savvy move, he made sure to surrender to the Scottish Covenanters, as they were known, in order to escape the clutches of the English Parliament. The Scottish Covenanters were called Covenanters because, in their stand against Charles' father, they had taken what was known as the National Covenant, essentially an agreement that Scotland would reject Anglicanism in favor of Presbyterianism in the church. Anglicanism, of course, was the English style of worship, with bishops as leading figures of the church, and the king as the ultimate supreme head. Presbyterianism was the preferred style of worship in Scotland, with the church being led by congregations and elder members of the congregations. Soon, Charles' mother Henrietta Maria, who had been sent to her home country of France, requested that her eldest son join her there. Although some in Charles' camp were opposed to this, he eventually decided that he would join his mother and eventually made his way to Saint-Germain. It should be noted here that both of Charles' brothers, James and Henry, were still in England and in parliamentary control, but James would soon be smuggled out of the country and make his way to The Hague in the Netherlands, where he was taken in by he and Charles' sister, Mary, Princess of Orange. James will come up again throughout Charles' story and indeed become a major political factor throughout Charles' life. It was around this time that Charles' father's attempts to pit the English Parliament and Scottish Covenanters against each other failed. A settlement was reached between the Covenanters and the English Parliament, and therefore, Charles' father was handed over to the Parliamentarians, with the Covenanters retreating back to their home country in the north. Therefore, due to the fact that the Parliamentarians were clearly victorious in the Civil War, the French conduct towards Charles, who was now living in their country, was less than enthusiastic. The French knew that, at that point, they would have to treat with the victorious English Parliament, and were careful to not show Charles too much affection in order to not offend those now in power across the Channel. For almost 2 years, Charles would call Saint-Germain in France home, and this place would be a meeting point for many royalists escaping from England. One of those royalists who joined him in Saint-Germain was his first cousin, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, who had been one of Charles' father's greatest generals throughout the First English Civil War. Rupert was a strong ally and military leader, and would play a serious role in some of Charles' future dealings. But serious developments were taking place in England, as alliances fractured along the ever-contentious line of religion. The two camps that had emerged were the Presbyterian camp, led by a majority of members of Parliament allied with the Presbyterian Scots in the north, and the independent Puritan camp, led by the New Model Army and its leaders, including Oliver Cromwell. After the New Model Army seized Charles' father and attempted to negotiate with him themselves, Charles' father entered into what is known today as the Engagement with certain Scots in the north, effectively starting the Second English Civil War. The Engagement agreed, in part, that Charles' father would implement Presbyterianism throughout England for 3 years. The New Model Army, with its independent Puritan and Leveller soldiers, were of course strongly opposed to this, and now became hell-bent on defeating the Scottish Engagers and putting Charles' father himself on trial for treason. The Scottish Parliament at the time was convinced to support the Engagement, and as part of this, invited Charles from his exile in France to Scotland to invade England with the Scottish army. Thus, Charles, his cousin Rupert, and other exiled royalists began to raise forces and traveled to The Hague, where they were welcomed by Charles' sister Mary, her husband the Prince of Orange, and Charles' younger brother James. The Hague is where Charles would, interestingly, take his first steps into the infamous waters of womanizing that he has long been remembered for. It is said that it was here at The Hague that he met and had his first sexual encounter with a woman named Lucy Walter. She would be the first of a long line of mistresses that would inevitably cause some trouble for Charles in his future. Both Lucy and Charles' other love interests will be discussed throughout his story. Additionally, it is important to note that Lucy Walter became pregnant with Charles' child, and despite Charles' unfortunate situation at this time, this child would end up playing a serious role in the future of the Stuart dynasty as he aged. He was named James Scott, but was also known as James Crofts or James Fitzroy. He too will come up again throughout the rest of Charles' story. But Charles' personal flings aside, serious political tasks were at hand. The future of Stuart rule, and indeed the English monarchy as a whole, hung in the balance of the events playing out in England. Charles' brother-in-law, the Prince of Orange, provided a fleet, and it soon traveled to the coast of England, but remained off the Kentish coast, waiting for contact from the Scots. However, the terms in which Charles and his mother demanded in order for Charles to travel to Scotland were too heavy. The Scots Engagers did not want to work alongside their old enemies from the English Civil War, and they did not wish to see Charles worship according to his own preferences while in Scotland. Thus, when a Scottish envoy sent to negotiate with Charles demanded these issues be altered, Charles relented and agreed to worship via Presbyterianism while in Scotland and to leave some of his royalist supporters behind, including his cousin Rupert. He traveled back to Holland to resupply and ready himself for his trip to Scotland. However, once there, news reached him that an Engager army had been defeated by Oliver Cromwell at the Battle of Preston. Thus, Charles decided against traveling to Scotland, as it was no longer considered safe enough to do so. In this, he was correct, for Cromwell had assisted the Scots opposed to the Engagers in seizing back power in Scotland, and this group rescinded Charles' Scottish invitation. It was at this point that Charles came down with smallpox and was forced to recover for weeks. Once he recovered, attention turned to Ireland as a possible royalist jumping-off point. Allied forces were raised in Ireland, and Rupert, now made Vice Admiral, set out for the island with a small fleet. Although Charles was formally invited to Ireland as well, he chose to stay at The Hague. But none of this would matter. Events in England took an even more drastic turn in 1649, when the new model army, fed up with their treatment by Parliament and Parliament's willingness to treat with Charles' father, purged Parliament of many of its members. The remaining Parliament members, allowed to attend the sessions, now became famously known as the Rump Parliament, and they were in a position to implement the radical changes desired by the army. A court was set up to try Charles' father for treason, and indeed, that is exactly what they did. Incredibly, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. On January 30th, 1649, Charles' father, King Charles I of England, was beheaded outside Whitehall Palace in London. Once word traveled to the continent, it was said that Charles learned of his father's death after one of his chaplains addressed him as Your Majesty for the first time. Charles, coming to the realization of what had truly happened, was said to have burst into tears. At 18 years old, he was now the new King of England. Charles may have technically been the King of England, Scotland, and Ireland in name, by right of inheritance, but the harsh reality was that he had no kingdom to rule. The Rump Parliament in England had abolished the House of Lords and the monarchy altogether in February 1649, shortly after Charles' father was executed, and by May had passed an act declaring England to be a Commonwealth, thus leaving the House of Commons in control of a now Republican England. Royalists would refer to this time with no king in England as the interregnum. Thus, Charles would need to find allies, and a major diplomatic campaign began. Unfortunately, although many sympathized with his situation and were unwilling to recognize the English Commonwealth, none were prepared to assist Charles militarily in regaining his throne. That is with the exception of one country, Scotland, where their attachment to their native Stuart kings remained strong. The Scots were not happy with the English Parliament's execution of Charles' father, not least because England was now firmly in the hands of English Puritans. One must remember that the independent and leveler-dominated New Model Army had prevailed against their Presbyterian opponents in the English Parliament, and the Scots were firmly Presbyterian. Thus, in February 1649, the Scottish Parliament had immediately declared that Charles was the lawful successor to his father Charles I. But one must be careful at this point not to see Charles and the Scots as too serious of allies. Negotiations would need to be held, and seeing that Charles was in a vulnerable position in exile and in no place to haggle over terms, the Scots pressed him on issues that they held close to their heart, specifically religion. A stipulation that the Scots put in place in order for Charles to gain any semblance of power in Scotland was that he needed to take the Covenants and agree to establish Presbyterianism as a national religion, not just in Scotland, but in England and Ireland as well. As we remember, the Covenants included the National Covenant discussed previously, which many Scots had taken in order to stand up to Charles' father, but also included something known as the Solemn League and Covenant, which had been sworn between the English Parliament and the Covenanters during the First English Civil War. Agreeing to the Covenants, however, was something that Charles could not accept, and thus he declined the offer put forth by the Scots. Charles was confident in this refusal in part due to the fact that he still had Ireland that he could potentially use as a springboard to take his kingdom back, and thus attention turned back to his western kingdom. Additionally, Charles was somewhat overstaying his welcome at The Hague, and thus it was high time that he moved on. By June, he and his royalist following did just that. They traveled back to France, once again to Saint-Germain. It should be noted that by 1649, the French king was Charles' first cousin, and at the time 11-year-old boy who would eventually famously be known as the Sun King, Louis XIV. Louis was 8 years younger than his cousin Charles, and his minority rule had started back in 1643. Louis will, of course, come up again throughout Charles' story. Charles moved back to the island of Jersey, preparing to travel to Ireland and meet up with his lieutenant there, who had been gaining support for him. Unfortunately, Charles' hopes of landing in Ireland and leading an army to England would not become a reality, for the English Parliament sent Oliver Cromwell at the head of a parliamentarian army to Ireland to begin what is known today as the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland, part of the Irish Confederate Wars. Thus, with the military might of Cromwell and the new model army in Ireland, the royalist cause rapidly declined, with the small fleet that Rupert had sailed to Ireland being forced to flee. With this change in events, attention was again turned back to the Scots, who still refused to change the conditions they had offered Charles previously. But Charles now had fewer options, and was more open to the idea of accepting the covenants. The Scots were surprised when Charles agreed to invite the Covenanters to negotiate at Breda, a Dutch town controlled by his Orangist brother-in-law and sister. The terms from the Scots remained harsh. Charles would have to take the covenants, agree to Presbyterianism, and to persecute Catholics in Scotland, England, and Ireland. Incredibly, Charles was now willing to sacrifice whatever necessary, his conscience included, in order to be put at the head of an army to take back his kingdom. And so, on May 1st, 1650, agreed to the Treaty of Breda, essentially granting almost everything the Scots had been requiring of him. He sailed to Scotland, but while he was just off the Scottish coast, he was forced to sign the covenants, something that his father had abjectly refused to do during his lifetime. With the covenants signed, he was finally able to land in Scotland, ready to make good his claim to his kingdoms. But although he may have finally made an agreement with a national power to reestablish himself as king, it was the quality of the agreement that would ultimately lead to trouble. The reality was that Charles took the covenants reluctantly, if not against his will, and thus a true conversion never truly took place. Charles' true purpose was not in the name of the Presbyterian or Scottish cause, and never would be. Thus, the agreement was looked at suspiciously from both sides, and would never attain any type of cohesiveness that could have existed if Charles and the Scots were truly in line ideologically. Nevertheless, preparations for a coronation commenced and celebrations began. However, unsurprisingly, bad feelings existed between the two camps. Immediately, the Scots banished most of Charles' followers from the realm, although this was largely ignored to the Scots' disgruntlement. But after news reached England of Charles' landing, the English Parliament decided that it was time to send their most celebrated military leader, Oliver Cromwell, to Scotland, and he was recalled from Ireland after a successful and brutal campaign there. He traveled to Scotland at the head of an army, and was met by a Scottish force led by David Leslie, not to be confused with Alexander Leslie, who was the Scottish military leader who had fought against Charles' father in the Bishops' Wars years prior. Thus began the Anglo-Scottish War, sometimes referred to as the Third Civil War. Interestingly, David Leslie had, in fact, also fought alongside Cromwell against the Royalist Cavaliers in the First Civil War. But that was then, and this was now, and Leslie was well aware of Cromwell's capabilities. Charles wanted to join Leslie's military force, but Leslie and the Scots were not convinced of Charles' conversion, and rightfully so. Therefore, they did not wish Charles to partake in the conflicts. Charles ignored them and joined the Scottish forces before Cromwell reached Edinburgh. However, the Scots would have none of this and forced him to leave to Dunfermline Palace. Initially, Leslie, knowing Cromwell's tactics and habits, defended commendably with his forces. However, Cromwell eventually retreated to Dunbar, at which point Leslie decided it was time for battle. The Scots advanced and trapped Cromwell, but the following morning, Cromwell launched a surprise attack and took the Scots by surprise. Leslie's Covenanter Scottish force was obliterated, leaving Edinburgh and Stirling open to Cromwell, who duly took both cities. After chaotic and poorly handled organization on the Scots side, it was finally agreed that the Scottish Royalists and former Engagers, who we remember lost power in Scotland after Cromwell's victory at Preston, would be allowed to raise a force for Charles. On New Year's Day 1651, Charles became the last monarch crowned at Scone Abbey as King of Scotland. Cromwell continued to pursue the Scots and employed a former royalist officer, now in parliamentary service, a man named George Monk, as a major leader in Scotland. As we will soon see, this man, General Monk, will come up in a major way later in Charles' story. After an English victory at the Battle of Inverkeithing, Charles' cause in Scotland virtually evaporated. Charles and what remaining forces he had left decided that they would push into England in hopes of collecting English support along the way before Cromwell could turn his attention back south. Charles made a proclamation that he would allow a free parliament and forgiveness to all who had wronged the monarchy, with the exception of the regicides, i.e., those who had been involved in his father's trial and execution. By August 1651, Charles and his forces reached the town of Worcester. Unfortunately, they had not been able to muster the support they had hoped, and worse yet, within a couple days, Cromwell appeared with a large army outside the town, leaving Charles and his forces trapped. On September 3rd, the Battle of Worcester took place, and Charles stood little chance. Although Charles was said to have fought bravely, his forces were greatly outnumbered, and when it became clear that all was lost after the parliamentarians stormed the city, Charles and a few of his remaining leaders escaped through the last remaining open gate. Charles' flight ended the Battle of Worcester, the last major battle of the Anglo-Scottish War, and of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms as a whole. It was an absolute and utter defeat for Charles, who was now in an incredibly precarious position in England. His only chance for any type of future was to escape back to the continent, but this would undoubtedly be a monumentally difficult task to accomplish. Charles would spend 43 nights on the run, and in the end would owe much of his good fortune to Catholics in England, who had for so many years been the target of attack after attack politically. Despite this, many Catholics and Royalists, of course, in England were more than willing to assist Charles in his escape attempt and went to great lengths to disguise him as he made his way south despite the £1,000 reward placed on his head. One of the Catholics who sheltered him was a priest named Father John Huddleston. He will come up at the end of Charles' story in a major way. A fortunate benefit to Charles' situation on the run was the fact that because the Catholics had been forced to conceal much of their practices and priests throughout the years, they were very organized when it came to the art of concealment. Charles' time in flight in England is, of course, when the famous oak tree incident took place. It was said that after Charles made his way to Boscobel House in Shropshire, Cromwell and his Roundhead New Model army tightened the noose and began vigorously searching for Charles there and in the surrounding woodland. Charles was forced to take refuge in an oak tree, which allegedly still stands to this day and is famously known as the Royal Oak. While the Roundheads searched for him below, he remained above, unseen, and was not discovered, thus allowing him to continue his escape to the coast. After multiple failed attempts to find safe passage across the channel, Charles traveled to Shoreham, where he was finally able to secure passage on a coal ship named Surprise. He landed in Normandy 2 days later to begin a most unfortunate chapter in his life. His situation had unfortunately deteriorated on the continent as well, as the French royal family were fighting internally, and his brother-in-law, the Prince of Orange, had died in November 1650. A few days after the Prince of Orange's death, his heavily pregnant wife, Charles' sister, delivered a healthy baby boy. This child, Charles' nephew, now inherited the deceased Prince of Orange's titles, and he would end up playing an incredibly massive role in the future of the English monarchy. He was named after his father, William, and is famously known today as William III of Orange. He, of course, will come up here and there throughout the rest of Charles' story. Thus, after Charles' brother-in-law's death, the House of Orange's power was greatly diminished for the time being. Those who were able to seize control in the Netherlands after the decline of the House of Orange were not eager to accommodate Charles, not least because many European powers still did not want to upset the English Parliament now in power in England. Therefore, Charles was forced to move in with his mother at the Louvre in Paris. Rupert also brought back the remaining royalist ship to France, but this had not been before Rupert's younger and favorite brother, another of Charles' cousins, Prince Maurice, had been lost at sea after being caught in a storm on his way to the Caribbean. Maurice had traveled with Rupert to England at the outbreak of the First English Civil War, and had served Charles' father loyally during the war. He had been made a Knight of the Garter in 1649, and his death was an unfortunate loss for the Royalists. Charles was now 22 years old in 1652, poor relatively speaking, and was in desperate need of money. His brother James assisted with this issue by removing himself from the royal payroll and joining the French royal army. James would develop serious military skills while in French service, and eventually, despite the events that would take place which would make him infamous, he became a talented soldier and military leader. It was said that after Charles had escaped from England back to France, his lifestyle of leisure and debauchery grew to new levels. He had had multiple affairs, including one with a married woman named Elizabeth Killigrew, which produced a child named Charlotte Fitzroy. The mother of his first child, Lucy Walter, was also still in the picture at this point, but would not be for much longer, as Charles soon cut ties. Charles' list of mistresses soon began to grow, but this list would continue to grow as time went on, as we will soon see. Although events had taken a drastic turn for Charles, the situation in England was morphing as well. Cromwell, being fed up with the inaction of the Rump Parliament, decided that it was time for something new. He dismissed the Rump and used his influence to nominate what would become known as the Barebones Parliament in 1653. This too would not provide Cromwell and his army officers what they were seeking, and thus it too was dissolved. Therefore, a document was created in England known as the Instrument of Government, in which Cromwell was initially formally offered the kingship of England. Although he considered it, he ultimately declined this offer and was instead installed as Protector of England, essentially making him king in all but name. This was the beginning of a time in England known as the Protectorate. Interestingly, in an ironic and walk a mile in my shoes kind of situation, a difficult sequence of events would play out for the new protector with regard to Parliament. The quote-unquote First Protectorate Parliament was called in September 1654, and Cromwell, previously so appalled at Charles' father's treatment of Parliament in the lead-up to the Civil War, found he encountered many of the same issues and hypocritically dissolved Parliament as a protector, just as Charles' father had done when he lived as king. The First Protectorate Parliament was dissolved by Cromwell in January 1655, after none of the 84 bills presented were passed by the members. Thus, a system of control was set up which essentially made England a military state, where areas of the country were governed by major generals of the army. Of course, one must not forget the Puritan nature of Cromwell and the army. Morality was regulated, with Christmas celebrations being forbidden, theaters being closed, and drunkenness being banned, among many other things. As one could imagine, this did not sit well with the populace. As far as Charles in exile was concerned, he still had underground royalists in England that could assist him in raising a rebellion or even in assassinating Cromwell if possible. But the Cromwellian government had a good network of spies, and any attempts that Charles made to gain ground in England was swiftly dealt with. Additionally, Cromwell ended the First Anglo-Dutch War in 1654, which eliminated the Netherlands as a potential place for refuge and made alliances with many foreign states, including France, putting Charles in a very vulnerable position. Thus, Charles was forced to turn his attention to Germany and the Holy Roman Emperor, where he was able to receive promise for funding. He left Paris in July 1654 and traveled to Spa, Belgium, part of the Spanish Netherlands, where he met up with his sister Mary, Princess of Orange. They had almost a sort of holiday together, traveling to Aachen, Dusseldorf, and Cologne before parting with each other. Although promised money from different sources, Charles was not regularly paid, and he continued to find himself in relative poverty. But after Cromwell and the English decided to attack Spain's Caribbean possessions, opportunity arose as the so-called Anglo-Spanish War broke out. With the breach between England and Spain, Charles could now ally with Spain, which is exactly what he did. As part of the negotiation with Philip IV, Charles agreed that he would return Spain's Caribbean possessions, lax laws in England against Catholics, and assist in recovering Portugal for Spain if he was reinstated as King of England. Unfortunately, although Spain entered into agreement with Charles and promised money to him, they, in reality, had too many irons in the fire and were not well off financially. Additionally, as was the case in Scotland during the English-Scottish War, both parties involved weren't truly on the same team and had conflicting interests. The French, now a quasi-enemy, had, as part of the treaty with the English, agreed to ban both Charles and his brother James. But as we just touched on, James did well militarily in French service, so the French found ways to keep him in France against the terms of the treaty. However, eventually Charles called upon his brother to join him in Bruges, and James hesitantly and loyally complied with this order. The French and the Spanish had actually already been warring since 1635, something known as the Franco-Spanish War, and the Spanish Netherlands, where Charles and his royalist exiles resided, had been a disputed territory between the two powers. Charles and James, now Spanish pensioners, did what they could to assist Spain in defending their territory when the French attempted to push into the Spanish Netherlands during this conflict, but it would all be in vain. The Spanish forces, assisted by Charles and James, were defeated at the Battle of the Dunes near Dunkirk in June 1658. Spain, now exhausted by war, would be forced to come to terms and was still not in a position to pay Charles' pension, thus making his financial situation continuously strained. Charles retreated to the Dutch border in hopes of making headway there through his sister and the Orangists in the United Netherlands. But in September 1648, while in the town of Hoogstraten in modern-day Belgium, Charles received stunning news from his brother James. Oliver Cromwell, the protector and makeshift King of England, was dead. The next incredible chapter of Charles' life had commenced. Although Charles' prospects in England increased tremendously after Cromwell's death, initially not much came of the development. Incredibly, despite Cromwell playing a large role in destroying the monarchy in England, his position as protector essentially made him king in all but name, and at the end of his life, he furthered the similarity between the monarchy and the protectorate by nominating his eldest son, Richard Cromwell, as his successor. Richard Cromwell was initially accepted with enthusiasm, and it seemed that the new second protector would be successful in his time in power. But the reality was that he was distrusted by the army, and when Richard Cromwell called a parliament in January 1659, fractured lines began to be exposed within the English government. Ultimately, the army strong-armed Richard into dissolving what is known today as the Third Protectorate Parliament in April, and reinstated the Rump Parliament, which, as we recall, was the parliament that had been established when the army prevented certain MPs from entering parliament via a purge prior to Charles' father's execution. The restored Rump Parliament re-established the Commonwealth without a king, single person, i.e. protector, or House of Lords. The army leaders involved in the restoration of the Rump had hoped that they would be able to control this group sufficiently, but they soon found this to not be the case. In October 1659, General Lambert and his army allies once again prevented members of Parliament from entering the Palace of Westminster, at which point appeals were made to General George Monk, discussed previously, who was with his army in Scotland, to defend Parliament. We remember that Monk had been Oliver Cromwell's governor in Scotland, but had been a royalist prior to making his connections with the Cromwells. Monk decided that he would come to Parliament's aid, and declared his readiness to uphold parliamentary authority and march to London. Lambert, the man who had purged Parliament again, marched north to meet Monk in November 1659, but his army slowly began to abandon him along the way, forcing him to retreat and return to London alone. Thus, the Rump Parliament was once again reconvened in December 1659. They declared George Monk to be the commander-in-chief of England and Scotland. Charles continued to try and find international support during these events, but eventually traveled to Brussels to be reunited with his brothers and then moved on to Breda. Monk, although believed to be defending the Rump Parliament's interests, in reality was looking to elect a new parliament, and the Rump Parliament was not on board with this. In fact, a restored monarchy was already being discussed, and Monk was in favor of this idea. Thus, Monk, in February 1660, took an even further step back in Parliament and reinstated the members who had been excluded from the purge in 1648. This, in effect, added further members to the Rump Parliament and restored the so-called Long Parliament, which was a parliament that had been called by Charles' father 20 years prior in 1640. This group now included many royalists, and they did call for a new parliamentary election and dissolved themselves in March 1660, opening the door to Charles to be restored to his crown. The new parliament that was elected would eventually be known as the Convention Parliament, and they met in April 1660. That same month, Charles had issued the Declaration of Breda, which promised religious toleration, payment to the army, and pardons for those who committed crimes against the monarchy during the English Civil War and interregnum, save for the regicides, i.e. those who were involved in the trial and execution of Charles' father. Therefore, with the Declaration of Breda confirming Charles' willingness to pardon, the Convention Parliament unanimously voted to restore the monarchy in England and declared that Charles had been rightful king since the death of his father in 1649. A delegation was sent to the continent to formally invite Charles home. Ironically, One of the men involved in this delegation was Sir Thomas Fairfax, the leader of the New Model Army during the English Civil Wars. By May 1660, Charles, with his brothers by his side, boarded a ship and traveled back to his homeland, finally recognized as the rightful king of his realms. Upon reaching London on his 30th birthday, he traveled to Whitehall to begin the process of wooing the populace and setting up his government. Many of those involved in the restoration were rewarded, including Monk, who was made Master of the Horse, and the laws related to the Puritan regulation of morality were eventually lifted, allowing theaters to reopen and certain celebrations to resume. Additionally, steps were taken to put into law Charles' promise for clemency. Thus, the Act of Free and General Pardon, Indemnity, and Oblivion was passed. This put into law the forgiveness offered by Charles in the Declaration of Breda, but it should be noted that there were still reprisals enacted throughout England, specifically related to those involved in Charles' father's execution, i.e. the regicides. In fact, only 2 of the 59 signers of Charles' father's death warrant still alive at the Restoration were pardoned, with the rest either being executed, imprisoned, or fleeing into exile. Although many of the regicides who had died prior to the Restoration simply faded into the past, some, including Cromwell, were tried posthumously, convicted of treason, and executed, meaning that their remains were disinterred, publicly hanged, and beheaded, with their heads being displayed over Westminster. Others that did not specifically sign Charles' death warrant, but were still considered as unworthy from being exempted due to their actions, were tried in this capacity as well and suffered similar consequences. Punishment against the regicides was all somewhat straightforward for the most part, but what would, unsurprisingly, not be straightforward was religion and the religious toleration that was to be extended. The episcopate, a staple of Anglicanism, which put bishops as major leaders of a national church, had been abolished in favor of other forms of religion, such as Presbyterianism and Independent Puritanism. Although the Convention Parliament was split on the issue, Anglicanism and Episcopacy would indeed be reinstated in Charles' kingdoms, including Scotland, which had been the arena that had sparked the English Civil Wars during Charles' father's time, specifically related to these issues. Pressure would be put on Charles to enforce Anglicanism, but we must remember that not only had Charles promised religious toleration, but he still remembered that he owed his freedom and perhaps even his life to the Catholics who had harbored him in England after the Battle of Worcester. But to many in England, toleration for non-conforming Protestants was one thing, but toleration for Catholics was a completely different story, as Catholics had long been persecuted within the country and were still greatly feared throughout the realm. Additionally, there were new religious players in the game at this point, one of which was the Quakers, who were one of the more religiously radical groups that emerged during the Civil Wars. They were equally disdained by Anglicans, Presbyterians, and Independent Puritans alike. The Quakers looked to Charles to protect them from persecution, and although most of Charles' government was opposed to this, he was open to the idea of protecting the Quakers and took steps to free some of them from prison. Ultimately, his wishes were ignored by many across England, who continued to persecute Quakers and Catholics in the rank-and-file levels of government. At this point, Charles was confronted by tragedies and scandal within his family. In September 1660, his youngest brother, Henry, Duke of Gloucester, died of smallpox, followed shortly thereafter by his sister, Mary, Princess of Orange, 2 months later. Furthermore, a woman named Anne Hyde had become pregnant and declared that Charles' younger brother and heir presumptive, James, Duke of York, was the father. She also claimed that she and James had been married, thus legitimizing her children. Anne Hyde was the daughter of one of Charles' longtime advisors, Edward Hyde, Earl of Clarendon, who had been with him before and during exile. He had also served Charles' father as well prior to being put into Charles' advisor group. Although James initially denied that he was the father to Anne's child or that he had married her, he was eventually forced to admit that it was true and acknowledge the child. Although this child would not survive, James and Anne would go on to have 7 more children, with 2 daughters surviving to adulthood. These 2 daughters, named Mary and Anne, would be raised Protestant, despite the religious scandal related to their father, which will be discussed in time. These 2 nieces of Charles would become crucial to the future of England's royal story, but will not be discussed at length here. Given the loss of siblings and the embarrassment of the heir presumptive, it was thought prudent by many for Charles to find a wife in order to produce heirs himself. Thus, with the aid of his cousin Louis XIV of France, who we remember was at war with Spain, a marriage was agreed to where Charles would marry Catherine of Braganza, the Catholic daughter of the King of Portugal. Spain, who was still trying to regain Portugal as part of their realms, were not happy with this agreement, especially since they had assisted Charles while he was in exile. But by the time the marriage negotiations had been concluded, Charles had actually already been involved in another affair. During the years leading up to the Restoration, he had interacted with a woman named Catherine Peggy, and this affair had produced 2 illegitimate children. It is also interesting to note that Lucy Walter had become a royal thorn in Charles' side in the years leading up to the Restoration. She had been a great embarrassment to Charles publicly after the two had departed each other's company, and Charles actually had to work strenuously in order to get his eldest illegitimate son James away from Lucy. Incredibly, after Charles and Lucy parted, she had been involved in the murder of her husband prior to dying herself in 1658, the year Cromwell also died, and thus that chapter of Charles' life finally came to an end, surely to Charles' relief. However, although Charles now had custody of young James, this son would prove to be just as much of a handful as his mother had been as he aged, as we will soon see. By the time Charles and Catherine were married in 1662, a new woman had filled the mistress role, a woman named Barbara Villiers, whose husband would eventually be elevated to the earldom of Castlemaine. The two would have 5 or 6 children together, both before and after Charles was married to Catherine of Braganza, and as one could imagine, Charles' new wife was not happy with this behavior. In fact, she was publicly embarrassed by her husband's actions, but there was little she could do, and Charles' infidelity would only continue, if not worsen, as the years went on. The Convention Parliament that saw Charles brought back to the English throne had been dissolved in 1660 in order to make way for a new parliament called Under Charles. Thus, in May 1661, what was to become known as the Cavalier Parliament came to be. Like the Convention Parliament before it, the Cavalier Parliament's makeup of MPs were decisively royalist and Anglican as well. It should be noted that just prior to the opening of this parliament, Charles had officially been crowned as King Charles II of England in an extravagant coronation ceremony. He had come a long way since his flight to the Scilly Isles years prior in his youth. The Cavalier Parliament immediately got to work undoing many of the acts or statutes that had been enacted previously, such as the one barring the bishops from the recently reinstated House of Lords. However, they conveniently left others in place, like the Triennial Act, which took away Charles' right to be the sole caller of parliaments. Charles attempted to legally lax the laws against Catholics, but this failed. Nevertheless, in practice, Catholics were said to have actually been treated more lax than had been done in the past, so there was a degree of victory that could be claimed here by Charles. Work in the Scottish Parliament began as well, with the Rescissory Act, which annulled any previous legislation of parliaments held during the civil wars and interregnum. Thus, the process of implementing the episcopate back into Scotland discussed previously slowly moved forward. Although Charles was said to have continued to seek toleration for Presbyterians, Quakers, and Catholics alike if loyalty was shown, he found this difficult as his royalist Anglican government were keen on persecuting nonconformists. This was evidenced by acts such as the Corporation Act of 1661, the Act of Uniformity of 1662, the Quaker Act of 1662, the Conventicle Act of 1664, and the 5 Mile Act of 1665, which in part forced oaths of allegiance and supremacy to be taken in order to hold office. Charles attempted to include provisions to allow people of his choosing to avoid adhering to some of these acts, but this too was denied. Thus, the so-called Great Ejection followed the Act of Uniformity of 1662, where thousands of Puritan ministers were forced out of their positions within the Church of England. Charles' popularity began to wane, not only due to his attempts to relieve Catholics and nonconformists, but due to his public affair after his wife had arrived in England. He also spent magnificently, and many believe this to be a serious detriment to his treasury. With this being said, Charles was not as zealously dedicated to religion as his father had been, and it only took a small rebellion to change Charles' willingness to support Presbyterians and Quakers. When that rebellion broke out and was crushed, he finally decided that he would address nonconformity and withdrew his support of them, turning his back on groups like the radical Quakers. In reality, forgetting about nonconformist Protestants was one thing, but turning his back on Catholics would be much more difficult for Charles, not least because of major events that were to present themselves related to his heir and brother, James. By the time Charles had been restored to power in England, the United Netherlands had acquired a leader in the form of a man named Johan de Witt, Grand Pensionary of Holland, a leading figure in the Dutch States Party. Charles and the English government had been assisted in exile by the Dutch Orangist Party due to Charles' sister being married into this family, but after the shift in power in the Dutch Estates General to the Dutch States Party, the political opponent of the Orangist Party, relations with the United Netherlands deteriorated. Although the Dutch leadership during Charles' exile had gone to war with Cromwell via the First Anglo-Dutch War, during the negotiations to end the war, Cromwell had secretly worked against Charles' nephew, discussed previously, William III, to make sure that he could never come back into power in the United Netherlands. Additionally, the treatment that Charles received from the Dutch, with the exception of the Orangist Party, wasn't particularly warm during exile. Unsurprisingly, Charles and his government soon found themselves in conflict with the Dutch, specifically related to commerce and overseas territories. Charles sent his ships under command of Rupert into Dutch-dominated areas, including Africa and the North Sea, in attempts to do trade there. The Dutch were unwilling to allow the English into their trade areas, and skirmishes ensued. Additionally, quarrels over the American colonies and Caribbean possessions eventually led to a serious outbreak and hostilities, culminating in what would become known as the Second and Third Anglo-Dutch Wars. Although the Anglo-Dutch Wars have their own plethora of interesting tangent discussion topics, here we will only touch on a few, starting with the Battle of Lowestoft in June 1665. This was an overwhelming English victory, and the English fleet was led by Prince Rupert and Charles' brother James. James had actually almost been killed in the fighting, to Charles' understandable anxiety. The Dutch were decimated, and the English lost only one ship. But despite this, things would take an unfortunate turn for the English. While the Dutch looked towards peace discussions, they rebuilt and improved their fleet of warships. Additionally, there was a terrible outbreak of bubonic plague in London, where over 7,000 deaths were recorded in 1 week alone. This forced Charles to move to Hampton Court in the countryside. The plague, along with Dutch privateering in the Channel, had major economic effects on England and Charles' royal revenue. Additionally, the Dutch were able to gain many allies against the English, including the French, led by their famous king and Charles' cousin Louis XIV. These things combined, along with Charles' perceived debauchery and financial extravagance, proved severely detrimental to his reputation at home. Nevertheless, the war raged on. Battles were won and lost by both sides to the point that by 1666, a sort of deadlock ensued. But the year of 1666 is famously known in England for a separate reason, for this was the year that contained not only part of the Great Plague decimation of London, but a separate event that shocked the English populace, the Great Fire of London. The fire took place in September 1666, and the fire was said to have started just after midnight in a bakery located on Pudding Lane, with the flames quickly spreading to the surrounding buildings. Firefighting had only come so far, and hesitation from the mayor allowed the fire to spread, eventually destroying over 13,000 homes. Charles and his brother James were said to have acted heroically during the crisis, filling buckets of water and encouraging the firefighters in their battle with the fire. In the end, after 4 days of destruction, the financial center of England and most of its greatest port had been destroyed, along with famous sites such as St. Paul's Cathedral, which would be famously rebuilt in Baroque style under the direction of Sir Christopher Wren. Charles took a large role in the rebuilding process as well, and was keen to have input in the process. Unsurprisingly, the fire was blamed on papists, aka Catholics, and Catholic detestation once again arose in England. The war with the Dutch and the French was dragging on, using up precious funds and becoming ever more unpopular throughout the realm. In June 1667, as peace talks were underway, the English suffered an embarrassing defeat at the Raid of Medway, where the English flagship, the HMS Royal Charles, was captured and towed away. It was time to find an end to the conflict, and peace negotiations were duly concluded at Breda in the Netherlands, resulting in the Treaty of Breda. Charles was forced to harsh conditions with regard to the territories that the English and the Dutch had squabbled over. Additionally, he was not on favorable terms with the Cavalier Parliament due to his perceived mismanagement of the war, along with the funds that had been granted for the war. The relationship with his brother James also took a hit when Charles sacked James' father-in-law, Edward Hyde, the Earl of Clarendon. With the squabble with his brother causing him stress, Charles turned to other men to show favor, and one of them would be his eldest illegitimate son, James, now Duke of Monmouth. Monmouth slowly began to gain affluence and was elevated into lucrative positions, something that Charles would soon regret. Louis XIV by that time had invaded the Spanish Netherlands yet again in an attempt to conquer the land for himself, beginning something known as the War of Devolution. He was doing well and was on par to continue his successes there, but Charles and the English, in an attempt to make up for some of the humiliation endured after the Treaty of Breda, formed an alliance with the Dutch along with Sweden. This alliance was to become known as the Triple Alliance, and this group was involved in mediating peace between France and Spain. Although Charles and the Dutch were not particularly friendly at this point, this treaty would be the precursor to a long-running alliance between the two world powers. Louis XIV of France, of course, was not happy with this new alliance, but eventually agreed to peace via the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. But interesting and incredible events were about to, allegedly, take place in England at this time. Charles and his brother James were still at odds with one another after the sacking of James' father-in-law, the Earl of Clarendon, but James had slowly been undergoing a conversion from Protestantism to Catholicism, although this was not something that was publicly announced or recognized. However, James alleged that in a private meeting, Charles confessed his desire to convert to Catholicism himself, and James claimed that it was in this meeting that a reconciliation between the brothers took place. This, of course, has been disbelieved by many, but given the events that were to follow, some believe that this meeting did actually take place. Perhaps the story could have been fully discounted today if it were not for the famous subsequent secret negotiations Charles had with his cousin Louis XIV. Much of these negotiations were aided by Charles' youngest and favorite sister, Minette, who was in France and married to Louis XIV's brother, the Duke of Orleans. In the negotiations, Charles requested soldiers, an alliance with France, and most importantly, money, which he hoped could free him from the bonds of the Cavalier Parliament, and in return, Charles incredibly offered to convert to Catholicism. If accepted, this would mean that Charles was publicly allied with the Protestant Dutch in Sweden, but secretly allied with the Catholic French. Louis, for his part, welcomed the idea of his cousin converting, but stipulated that the negotiations must include an attack on the Dutch, who were creating problems with his attempt to take over the Spanish Netherlands. If this was refused, Louis and the French were more than willing to make overtures to the Dutch themselves in order to find ways to divide the Spanish Netherlands between them. Thus, Charles agreed and concluded what is famously known today as the Treaty of Dover, which destroyed the public Triple Alliance with the Dutch and Sweden. It should be noted that Charles' sister Minette traveled to Dover to see this treaty through, but unfortunately, she would die just after the fruits of her labor were recognized upon her return to France. Charles' enthusiasm towards the treaty was said to have waned after his sister's death. Although Charles was initially required to convert to Catholicism publicly, this was pushed to a later date, and the two kings, Charles and Louis, agreed that they would together attack the Dutch, with provisions to divide parts of the United Netherlands between them should they be successful. Thus, the foundations of the so-called Third Anglo-Dutch War were being laid. But this war would not begin until 1672, and it was said that Charles, during the time leading up to the war, lived a sexual life of excess. 1668 through 1670 had been the time frame that new women entered Charles' life in the form of interchangeable mistresses. Barbara Palmer was still in his company often and remained at court, but two actresses soon became involved with Charles. The first, Moll Davis, would bear him a daughter named Mary in 1673, and the second, more famous mistress, named Nell Gwynn, would bear him two sons named Charles and James in 1670 and 1671. It was said that at this time, in addition to his known mistresses, many other women, both publicly known and not publicly known, were suspected of being intimate with the king. Eventually, Barbara Palmer would leave Charles' company completely, and in the time between 1670 to 1672 was replaced by a woman named Louise de Kerouaille. Nell Gwynn would remain as a regular in Charles' company moving forward, but Louise would hold perhaps the highest distinction in Charles' life of all of his mistresses, eventually being made Duchess of Portsmouth and a Duchess in France as well. The two would have one son named Charles in 1672, but 1672 was the year for war with the Dutch, and Charles finally, after receiving payment from the French, decided that it was time to make his move. He used questionable reasonings for initiating hostilities, in part related to a failure on the Dutch's part to publicly salute his ships, but in reality, the Treaty of Dover and subsequent agreements were truly the basis for the provocation. War was duly declared, and the Third Anglo-Dutch War officially commenced. However, just prior to this, Charles did something unexpected that would have a lasting ripple effect throughout history. Being financially propped up by French subsidies, he felt in a stronger position to impose his will, and thus put forward something known as the Declaration of Indulgence, which sought to relieve not only non-conforming Protestants in England, but Catholics as well, to the dismay of his peers in Parliament. This would be the beginning of a long sequence of events that would ultimately lead to disaster for the Stuart dynasty in England. When war finally commenced, Charles sent troops under his son, the Duke of Monmouth, to assist Louis XIV in France. Monmouth had continued to rise throughout the ranks of society and in confidence, and being put at the head of this brigade only furthered his individual confidence. Unfortunately for Charles, the Dutch proved more difficult an opponent than expected. The English fleet experienced a defeat at the Battle of Solebay, causing them to retreat for repairs, although many considered it a draw numbers-wise. Although Monmouth's invasion on land was initially successful, the French and the English troops were halted when the Dutch flooded their so-called Dutch waterline in Holland. The Dutch populace was very concerned over the Anglo-French push into the Netherlands, and thus, those in power suffered severe reprisals. Johan de Witt resigned his grand pensionary position, and Charles' nephew, William III of Orange, became stadtholder, essentially regaining power in the Netherlands. De Witt and his brother would eventually be hunted down and executed by the Dutch populace. Although Charles expected that his 22-year-old nephew coming to power would certainly be a benefit to his interests, he found William steadfastly dedicated to defending his home country and less willing to negotiate than he had hoped. The war drug on, costing money and men. Charles had to put into place some financial workarounds in England, and these workarounds, added with the French pension, made his financial position acceptable. But as the war continued and soaked up money and men, only Parliament could fund the financial amounts that were needed to continue the war. Now, Charles' Declaration of Indulgence would rear its ugly head. The declaration was extremely unpopular in England, as one could imagine, and although it has been argued that Charles was pressured into issuing it, it nevertheless had a serious impact on the minds of the members of Parliament. Although most supported the continuation of the war, they now used the war supply as a bargaining chip to attempt to control the state of religion in England. Of course, many of Charles' advisors, including James, urged Charles to keep his declaration in place above all else, and urged him to sacrifice even the war with the Dutch to make sure this remained in place. But after pressure from Louis XIV to remain in the conflict, Charles was forced to consent to what is famously known today as the Test Act. This act required any public office holder to take an oath that was impossible for any Catholic to take, which included denying transubstantiation of the Eucharist and receiving the Eucharist in an Anglican service. By this time, James had fully converted to Catholicism, and thus, the Test Act forced him to either A, go against his new religion, or B, resign his offices. James chose the latter, and therefore, the heir presumptive to the English throne, incredibly, publicly outed himself as a Roman Catholic. Of course, Charles technically could still produce legitimate children, but it was well established by this point that his wife, Catherine of Braganza, was most likely sterile. Discussions had actually been had about divorcing Catherine at the cost of the Portuguese international relationship, but Charles refused to abandon his wife. Due to this, and Charles' lack of legitimate children, James' position as heir carried some weight within the kingdom. Supply was granted for the continuation of the war, but with James now out of the picture as admiral, the command fell to Charles' cousin, Prince Rupert of the Rhine. Although other battles and skirmishes were fought, including the Battle of Texel, they were largely inconclusive. Unfortunately for Charles, the longer the war drug on, the more benefit was lent to the Dutch, as Charles could not continue the war with no victories. Additionally, William of Orange was actually gaining ground against the French, and Charles decided to go back on his word to the French to declare himself a Catholic publicly, which did not help relations with France. The war was soon disintegrating through Charles' fingers, and after James' public profession, the war as a whole was becoming increasingly unpopular in England. James exacerbated this matter by marrying his second wife, Mary of Modena, a staunch Catholic, thus bringing further concern to issues within England and distracting many from the perceived necessity of the war with the Dutch. Thus, when Parliament met in October 1673, the members had reached their breaking point, and Charles was forced to prorogue Parliament on account of the Commons' insistence that Charles act against James' marriage. Charles attempted to reinforce some of the penalties on Catholics, but it was to no avail. The damage had been done, and with Charles' refusal to disavow his brother's actions, little could be accomplished. Soon, William of Orange and the Dutch, knowing full well the troubles Charles was facing at home, issued him terms that he could not refuse, and leaked copies of this to the members of Parliament. Thus, Charles had little option but to treat with the Dutch. The Treaty of Westminster was signed in 1674, effectively ending the Third Anglo-Dutch War. Charles, knowing full well that Parliament could only give him further trouble, prorogued it yet again to a later date. Parliament would meet a couple times again, but both sessions resulted in no supply being voted. Charles continued to prorogue what was still the Cavalier Parliament, despite pressure from James and Rupert to dissolve it and start over. Additionally, a rift was beginning to grow between Charles' son, the Duke of Monmouth, and his heir presumptive, James, as Monmouth had for many years been seen as a possible alternative heir. These two men's lives would ultimately clash, although it would not be during Charles' lifetime, and will not be discussed here. Louis again was able to gain ground back in the Netherlands, and thus William of Orange became more open to negotiation. We must remember that William was in the line of succession to the English throne, as he was the son of Charles and James' sister Mary. Any way that he could further this claim would be to his benefit, and so negotiations were concluded, which were to see William marry his first cousin, Mary, James' eldest daughter. The 15-year-old Mary was unsurprisingly unhappy with this arrangement and broke down into tears when she learned of the match, but she had little choice in the matter. Although Mary's father, the heir James, was Catholic, and her now deceased mother Anne Hyde had converted as well, she had been raised as a Protestant with her sister Anne, and thus fit religiously into the picture. James, of course, was not eager for this marriage to take place, but he was already unpopular in England, and was eventually convinced to consent to it after prodding by Charles and other advisors. Little did he know that this marriage would prove disastrous for him in years to come. Unsurprisingly, the French weren't too keen on this marriage either, and relations deteriorated between Charles and Louis once again. The European politics waxed and waned as time marched on, until the need for a treaty finally became apparent. The Treaty of Nijmegen was finally signed between the French and the Dutch, essentially ending the Franco-Dutch War that had been raging for years. The Third Anglo-Dutch War and the Franco-Dutch War may have finally come to a conclusion, but that did not mean that difficulties for Charles came to an end, and in fact, there arose further complication in England, as Parliament now had time to focus on other issues, like religion. Religion had always been a source of contention between Charles and his government/people, as previously discussed, especially with his reluctance at times to handle harshly the nonconformist Protestants and Catholics alike. But in 1678, there emerged a tale that was to startle Charles and those around him and send the kingdom into a frenzy. This tale is famously known today as the Popish Plot, and its story and sequence of events surrounding its telling goes something like this. While Charles was walking through Whitehall, he was approached by a man claiming to have knowledge of an assassination plot against him. When this man was given an audience, he introduced Charles to a perhaps mentally unstable clergyman named Israel Tongue, who provided a document allegedly detailing a plot by Catholic Jesuits to assassinate him and raise a rebellion with French aid. Although Charles initially brushed this off and had his advisors look into the matter, he was eventually called back by his council to address this matter. The council had been introduced to Israel Tongue's so-called informant, a man named Titus Oates, who himself was said to have been quite an odd individual. Although the events that were to take place in England as a result of this alleged plot were to be interesting, it should be noted that this story is considered entirely fictitious and made up by Oates, who had concocted the story after a failed career in the Catholic Church as a priest. Nevertheless, with an alleged Catholic plot exposed, panic spread like wildfire, and when the Cavalier Parliament met again, this of course needed to be addressed. Charles continued to believe, correctly mind you, that the story was fake, but Parliament, especially the Commons, were all too ready to accept Oates' testimony. Further hysteria was added to the situation when the man who Oates had sworn his testimony to was found murdered, a crime that still has not been solved to this day. Unsurprisingly, with Catholic plotting causing a panic, many in Parliament turned their attention to the heir presumptive, James, and concluded that it was his faith that was encouraging Catholics to plot in England. Thus, the first steps into what would be known as the exclusion crisis would begin, with attempts to exclude James from power. As the political attacks on James commenced, attempts were made to make him take an oath of supremacy and to eliminate Catholics from government. Charles was able to defend his brother for the time being, but something, or someone rather, needed to be sacrificed, especially after Charles himself became more convinced that the plot may be true. Thus, 3 innocent men were tried, convicted, and executed as being principal plotters in the made-up story, with many Catholic laymen and priests suffering executions as well. Additionally, 5 Catholic lords were accused by Oates and sent to the Tower, with one of them eventually being executed and one of them dying in prison. Issues only persisted, or perhaps worsened, after Charles' secret negotiations with Louis and the French came to light. Thus, Charles, fed up with the situation and prodded by advisors, finally dissolved the Cavalier Parliament in January 1679, a parliament which had existed for almost 18 years. This would turn out to not be a benefit to Charles, for now a new parliament would need to be called, and when the elections were held, those elected turned out to be even more geared towards fighting against the crown and Catholic freedoms. Charles, in an effort to calm the situation, sent his brother abroad, to James' dismay. Despite this, when the so-called habeas corpus parliament actually met in March 1679, the problems continued. It is interesting to add as a side note here that during these parliaments, the two sides began to be referred to as the Whigs, those fighting against Charles and the Crown, and the Tories, those supporting the king. Thus, the exclusion crisis has often been seen as the beginning of Britain's modern-day two-party system. In this new habeas corpus parliament, the House of Commons incredibly presented an exclusion bill, which was a bill that was created in order to remove or exclude Charles' brother James from the line of succession, of course, due to his religion. With no supply being offered, Charles had little if nothing to gain by keeping Parliament in session, but dissolution was spurred on by other events. A Presbyterian rebellion in Scotland broke out, causing Charles to send his son, the Duke of Monmouth, to put it down, which he did with astonishing success. The rebellion ended with the rebels' defeat at the Battle of Bothwell Bridge. As we remember, the Protestant Duke of Monmouth had for many years been seen as an alternative heir to the Catholic James, and with his newfound glory after his victory over the Presbyterian Scots, he now began to fully get behind the idea of becoming the heir. Monmouth now regularly disagreed with his father, openly criticized his uncle James, and was becoming an all-around problem for Charles. Thus, with the exclusion issue still glaring, and the potential alternative heir Monmouth returning from the north in triumph, Charles dissolved the habeas corpus parliament in July 1679 in order to call another one anew. When Charles fell ill soon after, James returned from the continent unannounced, fearing that Monmouth would seize control if Charles died while he was out of England. Charles was firmly in his brother's camp when it came to succession, and not in his son Monmouth's. Charles had always been more open to negotiation and compromise than his father had been, but the one thing that he refused to give ground on was the hereditary succession, which rightfully belonged to his brother James. Thus, when Charles ordered James back to the continent once again, he ordered the same of his son. They both traveled to the Netherlands, but James was invited back in order to take control of the northern kingdom of Scotland, which he did. James crossed back across the Channel and headed for Scotland, while Monmouth, for his part, returned to England without invitation, feeling unfairly treated. Due to this, Charles removed his son from many of his positions and banned him from court. Rumors began to fly of Monmouth's legitimacy, in that Charles had actually married Monmouth's mother, Lucy Walter, prior to his birth. Charles publicly denied this, and Monmouth decided that he would tour the West, gaining support against his uncle James to his father's dismay and disgust. The hostility against James in Parliament remained, and when the so-called Exclusion Bill Parliament opened in October 1680, the fury continued. But Charles continued to fight, steadfastly and unwaveringly, against the Exclusion Bill, and was instrumental in ensuring that it failed in the House of Lords. Alternatives were suggested to possibly severely limit the power of James if he succeeded, although this was supported by Charles, which clearly contrasted him against his historically absolutist Stuart father and grandfather. The Commons, or Whigs, refused to compromise. Charles once again dissolved Parliament and ordered that the next one would meet in Oxford. This quote-unquote Oxford Parliament met in March 1681, but little changed in the way of negotiation. Charles offered a compromise in which his niece and nephew, Mary and William of Orange, would be granted the position of protectors, making his brother James a king in name only. But the Commons replied by working on yet another exclusion bill, in which Monmouth was formally suggested as a successor. But things had changed by that point. Charles had entered into another secret treaty with the French to secure funding yet again, as the Catholic French were willing to assist in making sure Catholic James did retain his heir status. Thus, the last Parliament of Charles' reign, the Oxford Parliament of 1681, ended after a week in dissolution. Once again, a Stuart king and his Parliament were frozen by confrontation, but by 1681, events would take an unsuspecting and chaotic turn. Charles was 51 years old, and his health would unfortunately not hold out for much longer. The last three parliaments of Charles' reign had been trying, but he was glad to hear that his brother James had returned to England for the first time in almost a year and a half. James had done well in Scotland, securing his grip on the nobility and Parliament there as High Commissioner. It was here in the Scottish Parliament that Charles and James would score their ultimate victory in the so-called Exclusion Crisis. With James' control in the north, the Scottish Parliament not only voted to supply funds, but also formally recognized James as heir via a Succession Act. This stated that the succession was solely determined by proximity of blood and could not be adjusted by Parliament, thus securing to a degree James' future in the line of succession. Although Charles hoped to put the succession issue behind him, hard feelings still existed in England. In 1683, the so-called Whig Rye House plot was discovered, which had as its intention the assassination of Charles and James in favor of Monmouth. Charles and James were lucky to escape after returning from seeing horse races earlier than expected. Many were executed and imprisoned as a result of the plot. As far as Charles' personal life went, Louise de Keroualle remained Charles' most serious companion, but Nell Gwyn continued in his favor as well. Their relationship with his son, the Duke of Monmouth, remained negative, and eventually Charles had his son arrested but soon released. Although Charles was discouraged by his son's behavior, he still retained a degree of affection for Monmouth, despite their butting of heads. Persecutions of Protestant dissenters and Catholics did increase, with the so-called killing time in Scotland and additional pushes for persecution in England as well. This was lessened only by Charles' now case-by-case individual pardons that he mostly handed out to either those who supported him during exile or those who supported his father during the war. The relationship between Charles and his nephew William of Orange was never particularly good, and much resentment remained between uncle and nephew. But as the days turned to months and the months to years, the end was inevitable for the king. Although the king had generally been a healthy individual, being able to throw off sicknesses in the past and exercising regularly through daily walks, in early 1685 he was taken seriously ill. The illness, unfortunately, was to prove to be the final sickness of Charles' life. Charles' final days were spent in utter agony, as his doctors bled and blistered him repeatedly in counterproductive attempts to help him get better. Despite this, Charles was said to have taken the pain bravely. But perhaps the most incredible moments of Charles' life were to happen as it came to an end. While Charles lay dying, his brother and heir James cleared the bedchamber with the exception of a couple Protestant earls. Then, a man was brought to Charles' bedside. It was none other than the Catholic priest who had aided Charles in his escape from England after the Battle of Worcester decades prior, Father John Huddleston. Incredibly, Charles, in the final days of his life, converted to the Catholic faith, with Father Huddleston performing the necessary rites. On the night of February 5th, at Whitehall Palace, Charles expressed his devotion and love for his wife Catherine, and for his brother James, and requested that his last remaining mistresses, Louise and Nellie, be looked after. This, of course, is where the well-known phrase often attributed to Charles, "Be well to Portsmouth and let not poor Nellie starve," is derived from. The next morning, February 6, 1685, just before noon, King Charles II of England faded into unconsciousness and died. He was 54 years old. For a time, he was left in his bed, covered by a sheet, as the necessary steps were taken in the process of succession. Although a state funeral had initially been planned, anxieties surrounding his brother's ascension caused his ceremony to be dramatically scaled down, with an evening burial being held. Charles was laid to rest on February 14, 1685, in a vault in the south aisle of Henry VII's Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey in London. A marker on the floor can still be seen marking where he lies in Westminster to this day. The life and reign of King Charles II is one of the more incredible stories one will encounter when discussing the English monarchy. From his youth, tension was ever present in Charles' life, being born during the lead-up to the English Civil Wars and immediately becoming the heir apparent to the English crown from birth. Upon the outbreak of the Civil Wars in England, he was sheltered and utilized by his father politically, before being sent to play a role individually in the war effort as a teen. As the tide turned against his father, and he was forced from England to begin his exile, he could have never fully understood or even remotely expected the poverty and danger that awaited him on the continent, as Cromwell and the Republican parliamentarians continued their consolidation of power in England. His ascension to the English throne was unlike any king or queen before him or after him, taking place in perhaps the worst possible way and in the worst possible position. The harsh realization that he must have endured after realizing that his father had been executed as a traitor, and that the weight of sovereignty with no kingdom to support him was now on his 18-year-old shoulders, must have been sobering. This, perhaps, is what elevates Charles' story into the stratosphere of incredibility. For some time, The likeliness that he succeeded in becoming a true nationally recognized and crowned King of England was very low, and the fact that he was even able to keep himself in a position to make good his claim shows that a good deal of political skill and understanding had to exist within Charles' mind. He did fail multiple times, and indeed was aided by impeccable luck often, but what remains true is that Charles did become the lawfully and rightfully recognized crowned monarch of England, despite his appalling situation initially, and this should not be understated. Of course, his time as king has its fair share of issues and potential criticisms. Although many were happy to be relieved from the Puritan restrictions on pleasure and leisure, eventually Charles' perceived debaucherously scandalous behavior did affect his reputation for a time, and led to an unfortunate and embarrassing existence for his wife Catherine. His involvement in initiating additional Anglo-Dutch wars, along with his perceived lavish lifestyle of spending, also did not help his reputation at times either. Religion is perhaps what comes to many people's minds when thinking of Charles, due to his back-and-forth treatment of Catholics and Protestant dissenters, due to his support of his Catholic heir James, and due to his conversion to Catholicism on his deathbed. But how truly pious Charles really was, and how seriously he felt towards the old faith is hard to say, and is still debated. Yes, he was aided by Catholics in his escape after Worcester, and yes, he attempted many times to relieve Catholics in England from oppression, and yes, he continued to support his Catholic brother and heir James. But Charles was never throughout his life considered particularly zealous in his religion, and therefore, the conversion that took place on his deathbed could simply be attributed to the situation, that situation being a man already out of touch with reality on his deathbed, hardly present mentally, willing to go along with whatever those by his side at the time suggested. On the other hand, he very well could have been truly dedicated to the Catholic faith. Had Charles truly desired to convert for many years, but felt compelled to remain Protestant for political purposes, one can never truly know. Whatever the case, the struggle over Catholicism and religion would not end with Charles' death, and indeed, this issue would lead to some of the most incredible royal events in the history of England. However one may view Charles, either as a master fornicator or as a merry monarch, it cannot be denied that he was a brave, politically savvy, lucky, and extremely charismatic king of England, who has cemented his position in the ranks of English kings and queens. Despite his reign being flanked by two of the most troubled reigns in the history of the English monarchy, Charles has not been forgotten and remains at the forefront of discussion for his successes in his role as king, not only for regaining the crown in the name of Stuart sovereignty, or for reuniting a country after a debilitating war, but indeed for bringing back the idea that he was, in fact, the king of merry old England.